As I implied, my father practically ceased living with my mother nearly 20 years before the Wilde Queensberry case came on, and 7 years before it came on, she divorced him. During the whole of those years, he made a practice of writing her brutally abusive letters. I have read some of these letters, and they are the letters of an unmanly brute or a crazy lunatic. On one occasion before the divorce, he suddenly turned up at my mother's house near Ascot, and turned her and all of us children out of the house at 24 hours' notice because he wanted to come there with a party of his friends, including a certain lady whom it was impossible for my mother to meet. My mother had herself invited a party of 12 friends for the race week, and my little sister and 3 of us boys were also in the house. We all had to clear out, bag and baggage, the next day and go up to London. My father was a madman, and his mania was to persecute my mother. My mother was and is an angel and a saint who has never done a wrong thing or thought a wrong thought in her life. When my father was dying, she went to him, and in the lucid interval he expressed his contrition, but right up until the time of his final illness he continued to persecute her. My eldest brother, Drumlanring, was, just before his early and tragic death, private secretary to Lord Rosebery, who was then Minister of Foreign Affairs under Mr. Gladstone. Rosebery suggested an English peerage should be bestowed upon Drumlanring, which would enable him to be a lord-in-waiting to the Queen. There is no English peerage at present in our family. My father was a Marquis, Earl, Viscount, and Baron, but they were all in the peerage of Scotland, and by an absurd anomaly and injustice to Scotland, a Scottish peerage does not carry with it a seat in the British House of Lords. The head of our family had always been elected as a representative peer, about almost as a matter of course. My nephew, the present Marquis, is a representative peer, and my father sat as a representative peer until he made a scene one year by declaring he was not a Christian and refusing to take the oath, which he characterized as Christian tomfoolery. Drumlanrig, wishing to bind him down and commit him irrevocably to the consent to be a peer, begged him to write directly to Gladstone to the effect indicated. This my father did. He wrote to Gladstone thanking him and expressing his great satisfaction at the honour done by Her Majesty to his son. Drumlanrig was made a peer of the United Kingdom as Lord Kelhead. The title is now extinct as he died without heirs of his body, but within a month my father was writing abusive and insulting letters to him, the Queen, Mr. Gladstone, and chiefly to poor Lord Rosebery. He actually threatened to horsewhip the last named, and followed him for that purpose to Hamburg, where he used to walk up and down outside Rosebery's hotel with a dog whip in his hand. The late King Edward, then Prince of Wales, at last interfered, and by the exercise of much tact and conciliation induced my father to give up the idea of thrashing Rosebery. My father's treatment of my second brother, Percy, late Marquis of Queensberry, and at the time of the Wilde affair, Lord Douglas of Hawick, was just as bad. When Percy married his wife, the charming daughter of a Cornish rector, the offshoot of an ancient and gentle family, he abused and insulted him without rhyme or reason, and made foul aspersions on his girl wife and her family, who were utterly unknown to him. He always refused to see my brother's beautiful children, 2 boys and a girl, and he died without ever having set eyes on any of them, simply because my brother Percy, who loved me dearly, stuck up for me when my father attacked me with brutal abuse and insult after ignoring and neglecting me for years. My father exhausted his vocabulary in abuse of Percy, and not content with that, showered obscene and insulting letters and postcards on his young wife. Driven nearly frantic by this treatment, my brother, who simply because I asked him to help me had gone bail for Wilde after he was committed for trial, met his father by chance one day in Piccadilly, went up and asked him to desist from writing obscene letters to his wife. My father thereupon, to quote from the report, made a vulgar noise with his lips, and Percy hit him. My father hit back, and several blows were exchanged before the police came up and took them both in charge. This was the Queensberry who was to be presented to the jury and the public. I attended the consultations with Sir Edward Clarke the lawyer, and told him all the story I have told here, and a great deal more beside. The main point was to show his pretended solicitude for his son and his alleged desire to save him were nothing but a hypocritical pretense, and his real object was to do what in fact he succeeded in doing, ruin his son, and finally break the heart of his martyred wife. Even if we had lost the case, there would have been no subsequent criminal prosecution of Wilde at the very worst. All the sympathy and all the feeling should have been on our side instead of on Queensberry's. This is what I knew and what I was thinking. When I met Shaw and Wilde at the Café Royal, I had screwed Oscar up to the sticking place, and I had all my family behind me, and I had paid out of my own pocket all the expenses of the case. I paid £360 for the cost of Wilde's case, which is always ignored by the Ross-inspired biographers. When, therefore, Shaw gave his advice based on a one-sided knowledge of the facts, I resented it, and I was terribly afraid that Oscar would weaken and throw up the sponge. I knew he was an awful coward. I did not dare tell you our case for fear that I might not convince you, and you and Shaw might, even after hearing it, argue Wilde out of the state of mind I had got him into. My one object was to get him out of the Café Royal as soon as possible, hence my appearance and rudeness. I was rude, I quite admit. I suppose, after all, it is necessary to a complete comprehension of the case that I should fill in the gaps in the narrative. The story has been told so often I am apt to forget that many of my readers may not know. What happened was, after I had known Wilde a few months, and had been a great deal with him, my father suddenly one day spoke to me about it, and told me Wilde was not a fit man for me to associate with. I must do my father justice to say at this stage he was not unkind or offensive. He light-heartedly told me that I must give up knowing Wilde, and seemed to think this would be quite enough. Naturally, considering in the first place I was of age and free to choose my own friends, and in the second place my father neglected me for years, and had never shown more than the very slightest and most perfunctory interest in me, I ignored my father's instructions. I wrote to him and told him I did not see any reason why I should give up my friend, and I really could not think of such a thing. I wrote to my father a perfectly respectful and affectionate letter, begged him not to interfere. He replied, telling me I was a fool and a baby, and I did not understand what I was doing. The controversy began to get acrimonious, and my father had already begun to make threats of cutting off my allowance when, while I was lunching with Oscar at the Café Royal upstairs, my father came in and sat at another table. I immediately went over to him and asked him to come and join Wilde and me for lunch. He refused at first, but then said very well, and rather sulkily came over to our table. I introduced them to each other. Oscar exerted himself to be agreeable. He was in good form, and in about 10 minutes he had my father laughing and listening eagerly to his conversation. This lunch was such a success that when they got on to Christianity, which was my father's bugbear and therefore his favorite topic, he actually gave public lectures against Christianity, and he always described himself as an agnostic. Lunch was over, and they had got to the cigar, liquor, and coffee stage. In the end I got bored and left them at about 3 o'clock, still talking to each other. When I saw Oscar that evening, he informed me, with pardonable pride, he had completely got round my father. They were now great friends, and had arranged to meet again. I was of course delighted to hear this, and still more so when 2 days later I got a letter from my father saying he wished to take back all he said about Oscar Wilde. He considered him a charming fellow, very clever, and he did not wonder I was so fond of him. He went on to say that he had been told by his old friend, Lord de Grey, Wilde was a friend of his and Lady de Grey, and that he was perfectly all right in every way, besides being a man of genius, a most delightful and amusing talker. This pleasant state of affairs lasted, however, only about 2 months. One day I got another letter from my father, repeating all his old accusations against Wilde and requiring me to give an undertaking on my word of honor not to see him or associate with him again. Failing this, my father told me he would stop my allowance. I wrote back an angry letter, in which I said I declined to do anything of the kind. I reminded my father of his neglect, said I did not consider he had any right to interfere in my life, and I told him if he was mean enough to stop my allowance he could go ahead and do it, which he promptly did. I am not justifying my conduct. I am merely relating the facts. No doubt it would have been far better for me if I obeyed my father. My main responsibility for the trouble must rest with my father. His brutal treatment of my mother, his nosy repudiation of Christianity, which had resulted in his being practically turned out of the House of Lords, the fact he himself was living a notoriously immoral life with his mistress, deprived him of what in other circumstances would have been his legitimate authority. Considering such a short time before he had met and liked Wilde, and had actually written telling me he withdrew his aspersions, and gave me full authority to go on with my friendship, I felt he had no right to adopt the threatening and bullying attitude which he had now taken up. I am the last person in the world who can be bullied or threatened into doing anything. In that respect, I very much resemble my father. Neither of us would give way. My father wrote to me in insulting terms, I replied in the same vein, and when he wrote to me his most outrageous letter of all, in which he made a perfectly untrue statement as to something which he alleged he had seen with his own eyes, I sent him my celebrated telegram, "What a funny little man you are." I did this deliberately, as being what I consider the most effective way of hitting back at him. Harris, in his Life and Confessions of Oscar Wilde, says I showed feminine ingenuity in devising such a telegram. That is typical of Harris's spite, which are far more feminine, and in bad sense, than mine have ever been. My father at that time, and indeed all his life, was a formidable person. He was a man who had established a reputation as a dangerous man. He was, at one time, amateur lightweight champion boxer. He repeatedly threatened to thrash me if he found me in Wilde's company. He went round to all the restaurants we frequented and warned the managers and maitre d's that he intended to assault both Wilde and myself if he caught us together on the premises. When I heard this, I made a point of going regularly with Wilde to these very restaurants. I wrote more than once to my father and told him that on such and such a day, at such and such an hour, he would find us in such and such a restaurant, and I invited him to come round and see what happened to him if he started any of his ruffian tricks. I see nothing feminine in this conduct. No doubt it was wrong of me to defy my father, but I question whether Harris himself, for all his ancient pistol truculence, would have had the pluck to do as much. Everyone in London was apparently afraid of my father, with the solitary exception of myself, for he was allowed to do things which would have been tolerated in no one else. No one ever had the courage to tackle him. To do Oscar Wilde justice, he showed plenty of spirit, and was not unduly intimidated by my father's threats. In the various letters my father sent me, he libeled Oscar Wilde quite sufficiently for him to have taken proceedings against him long before he actually did. I am not and never have been at all ashamed of the fact I urged Oscar, from the very first, to take proceedings. According to what were then my lights, I did right in doing so. I told him he should go for my father at once. If he had done this, my father would not have had a leg to stand on. The evidence which my father got later took a long time to collect, and could not have been available at the time when he first started his attack. History repeated itself when I went for Ross. If Ross had started proceedings against me directly after I first began libeling him, he would have almost certainly have succeeded in squashing me. After the first night of Oscar's play, The Importance of Being Earnest, at the St. James Theatre, my father went to the box office with a bunch of carrots in his hand, which he proposed to throw at Wilde when he appeared before the curtain at the end of the play. He was refused admission to the theatre. I was absent when this happened, but on getting a letter from Oscar relating the incident as well as an account of the great success of the play, I rushed back to London from Biskra. Shortly afterwards, my father left one of his cards at one of Oscar's clubs, the Albemarle, on which he had written the words, "Oscar Wilde posing as sodomite." On this, Oscar Wilde took action. In the book, Oscar Wilde and Myself, which I wrote in collaboration with Crosland, there is, written by Crosland, an account of this episode which gives an entirely false account of my own actions at this moment. I am, of course, myself responsible for this mistake, because I asked Crosland to write this part of the book, at the time so shaken and unnerved by the experiences I had been through. As a matter of fact, Robert Ross was at the time Wilde's adviser in the matter. It was Ross who induced Wilde to go to his own solicitor, Mr. Humphreys. the last solicitor in the world who could be useful to Wilde in such a juncture, because Humphreys was a family solicitor and had no experience in criminal matters. He knew nothing whatever about Oscar Wilde. I mention this because I wished to evade responsibility for advising Oscar to proceed against my father. I had advised him to do it long before, but Oscar told me he had got a warrant for my father's arrest, and his solicitor was Humphreys. I said, "Why on earth don't you go to George Lewis?" George Lewis was a personal friend of Oscar Wilde. He knew a great deal about him, and he was at the time the only solicitor in London who was really competent to deal with the situation. After the failure of Oscar's prosecution of my father, when Sir Edward Clarke threw up the sponge, and my father was acquitted, I drove with Oscar to George Lewis's office. It was then too late. George Lewis had actually appeared for my father at the police court, but owing to his friendship with Oscar and his wife, he told my father it would be impossible for him to go on with my case. I certainly had always advised Oscar to fight my father, but I was not impervious to reason, and if George Lewis had assured Wilde he had no chance, and was cutting his own throat and playing into my father's hands, I would probably have been convinced, and in any case I had no power, though both Harris and his friend Bernard Shaw seemed to assume that at the age of 24 I was entirely responsible for everything Wilde did or did not do, to make Oscar Wilde disregard the advice of his solicitors. As it was, the case was hopeless from the moment it reached the Old Bailey. Quite apart from his cleverness, he had the most wonderful material, Sir Edward Clarke, for cross-examination in the case of Oscar Wilde that any counsel was ever blessed with. Sir Edward Clarke made no attempt to take the wind out of Prosecutor Carson's sails by asking Wilde in his examination the questions in a modified form. He left everything to Carson and to his unfortunate client. That same evening, Oscar Wilde was arrested in my rooms at the Cadogan Hotel in Sloane Street. I was with him from the moment when the case against my father was abandoned by Clarke right up into about an hour of his arrest. At the moment when he was arrested, I was away. I had gone to the House of Commons to see my cousin, George Wyndham, and find out for certain whether there was to be a prosecution. When I got back to the hotel, Oscar was gone, with the detectives who arrested him. I immediately followed him in a cab to Bow Street and tried to bail him out. I did not know anything about those things in those days. I was in a frightful state of despair, but I never for a moment thought of clearing out, as Ross and all the other immediate entourage of Wilde did. All those faithful friends left the country and remained abroad till Wilde was convicted. I do not imagine I was ever in the slightest danger of being arrested myself as the result of my father's noble efforts to save me, but it is the fact I was warned that I was in great danger both by my friends and my enemies, who agreed in hoping that I would leave the country. I stayed on in the Cadogan Hotel. My brother Percy turned up the day after Oscar's arrest and gave me £250. I was cleaned out. All my money went to Oscar's solicitors and counsel. He told me he would stick to me through thick and thin. I went to see Oscar at Holloway Prison every day up till the time he was committed for trial, except on the day when I went to see him at Bow Street Police Station. In the intervals of Oscar's appearance in court, I spent several hours with him in a comfortable room upstairs, cigarettes and whiskies and sodas distinctly not barred. Sir Edward Clarke put the lid on his performance at the Old Bailey by failing to cross-examine the witnesses at the police court, and Oscar and Alfred Taylor were committed. At that time, of course, I knew nothing about the law courts. Neither did Oscar. We were really of being entirely in the hands of our legal advisers. A more terrible position for a man is difficult to imagine this side of hell. If I had known about the law courts what I know now, I would have urged Oscar to say if Sir Edward Clarke would not cross-examine the witnesses, he must request him to retire and let someone else do it instead. We were both such simpletons in legal matters, it never even occurred to either of us that Sir Edward Clarke was not performing. I used to see Oscar every day at Holloway in the ghastly way that visits are arranged in prisons. The visitor goes into a box, rather like a box in a pawn shop. There is a whole row of these boxes, each occupied by a visitor, and opposite facing each visitor is the prisoner. The two sides of visitors and prisoners are separated by a corridor about a yard in width, and a warder paces up and down the corridor. The visits last a quarter of an hour. The visitor and the prisoner have to shout to make their voices heard above the voices of the other prisoners and visitors. Nothing more revolting, cruel, deliberately malignant could be devised by human ingenuity. And it is to be remembered I am speaking of a remand prison, where the prisoners are awaiting trial, and possibly quite innocent. Poor Oscar was rather deaf. He could hardly hear what I said. He looked at me, with tears running down his cheeks, and I looked at him, such as it was, as he told me in nearly every letter he wrote, and he wrote every day with clockwork regularity. This interview was the only bright spot in the day. He looked forward to it with pathetic eagerness. There was literally nothing else I could do for him. The world outside the prison was howling for his blood like a pack of wolves. One of the evening papers had an article describing his first night in the cell at Bow Street, where he was locked up on the night of his arrest. With ferocious glee it described how he paced up and down all night. I do not remember ever before or since reading such a revolting article, full of devilish malice and bestial cruelty. Certainly whatever poor Oscar had done, from the moment the prison gates closed upon him, he began to redeem himself by suffering, and even to shine, in contrast to the conduct of his enemies. At the noble game of hitting a man when he is down, the English can give points to any other nation on earth. The prosecution of Oscar Wilde never had any moral force behind it, and as a result it produced nothing but a crop of evil and calamity. It was dictated by vengeance and hypocrisy, unaccompanied by any genuine moral purpose. The man who brought it about was an immoral man, a bad father, a worse husband, an avowed atheist, a man who did not scruple to sacrifice his own son and break the heart of his long-suffering wife simply to gratify his feelings of revenge and his passion for notoriety. I was before the trial beginning to be a little tired of Oscar's goings-on, even allowing for the fact he of course concealed his infidelities as much as he could. We had several acrimonious quarrels. In the ordinary course of events my infatuation for him would have worn out, and obviously his for me was a very much less enduring and tremendous affair than he himself imagined it. If it had not been so, he would scarcely have made such a complete volte-face in his attitude about me after being in prison only 9 months. I do not blame my father for trying to separate me from Wilde, but I do blame him bitterly for the way he tried to do it. For his spectacular victory at the Old Bailey did my poor father no good. He was pursued by furies ever afterwards, up to the time of his last illness. A great number of people of his own class, who did not bother their heads over much about what happened to Queensberry's boy after his father ruined him, yet definitely drew the line from that time at Queensberry himself. He was cut by many of his older friends. My godfather, dear old Lord Robert Bruce, who was in the Navy with my father, told me years later he never spoke to my father again. He was forever estranged from his son and heir, my brother Percy, from Percy's wife and children. And though he received me back into favor for a short time, about a year before his death, our reconciliation did not last long. He wanted to know what exactly my relations were with that beast Wilde. After Oscar's conviction, I remained in France for a time and then went to Naples and Capri. I had a villa at Capri for about 6 months, and I stayed there right through the summer, spending most of the time in the water. During this period I wrote some of my best poetry. I then returned to Paris, and while I was there I was asked by the Mercure de France, the well-known literary monthly magazine, to write an article giving my version of the Oscar Wilde affair. I accepted the invitation, and I wrote an article for the paper in English. The article was translated into French, and in it I included a quantity of extracts from the letters which Oscar had written to me while he was in Holloway jail, and while he was staying at the house of the Leversons when he was on bail. I believe my article and letters had not been prevented by the possibly well-meant but disastrous influence of Robert Harborough Sherard, which would have had the effect of completely rehabilitating Oscar in France. Sherard saw Oscar in prison and told him I was going to publish all his letters in a newspaper. The result was Oscar commissioned him to stop the publication of his letters. Thus, for the second time, Oscar Wilde, by his own misguided action and acting on the bad advice of those who had the access to him which was denied to me, dealt a fatal blow to his chances of rehabilitation. When he begged me to leave the country before his trial and put it out of the question that I should be called as a witness on his behalf, he threw away his chances of acquittal as I could have acquitted him. And now when he prevented me, who at that time loved him passionately and had no thought but to try to help him and lift him up out of the gutter into which he had fallen from defending him, he once again threw away his trump card. My article and letters were designed to show that there was a fine and noble side to the whole of this business, which Oscar's enemies, assisted by his feeble defenders and fat-headed friends, dragged down into the kennel and the stews. The letters which I intended to publish showed Oscar in a light which has never been revealed to anyone except myself, and the very few people to whom I showed the letters. At the time he wrote them, the anguish of his mind, coupled with what shone out at that time unmistakably as his real love for me, lifted him into realms of altruistic beauty and pathos which he never reached at any other time of his life or in any of his published works. I have never known anyone who could read these letters without genuine emotion. I have shown them to persons who hated and despised Oscar Wilde, and they have read them and shed tears. They showed him to be one who had forgotten self in his love for someone else. They were a million miles removed from the artificial. My father produced specimens of his attitude to me, slim gilt soles, flower-like lips, and all the other bag of tricks. These letters had the ring of genuine feeling, tragic emotion, sublimated passion. For once in his life, and for a period extending over many weeks, facing as he was a world which was one vast nightmare of unknown terror and hostile glares, he thought more about someone else than himself. The alchemy of passionate sincerity transmuted his thoughts into pure gold. One of them contained an apology for his whole attitude towards me, and what I meant to him. And when I say love, I mean love, and not physical passion or desire or anything else. Once these letters had been published and read, there would have been an end of that terrible laughter of the world, which, as one of Wilde's characters says in Lady Windermere's Fan, is a thing more tragic than all the tears the world has ever shed. I say it in excelsis, for love essentially must needs be chaste, and being contracted to unchastity, even in marriage, knows essential loss, and falls into a malady of waste, squandering the expended spirit's minted fee for that which in itself is worthless dross. As Oscar said to me in one of these letters, pleasure hides love from us, but pain reveals it in its essence. He knew that then, but he forgot it too soon. I bitterly regret these letters were not published at the time to which I refer. I wish it occurred to me that the friend who advised me to burn these letters was also a friend of Robert Ross, and the advice he gave me to destroy these letters was tendered only a few months before the trial of the ransom action for libel. I wish my memory were better. I have recorded in this book a few of the phrases from them that have stuck to me from memory. A little while after the episode of the cancellation of my article, a book was published, and I am informed that a single copy of a book of my poetry was sold about 2 years ago for 10,000 francs. Of those I had, I gave away many, and the rest disappeared. I am glad to think that my first poems were published in France, a country which I have always loved, and I recall with satisfaction that Shelley's first volume of poetry was published at Pisa, from the beginning when was aught but stones for English prophets. During the last 3 months of his imprisonment, Oscar Wilde wrote the letter to me which constitutes the whole part of the book called De Profundis, and the unpublished part which is now in the British Museum. I never saw it, or had the slightest knowledge of it, till more than 12 years later, and to this day I do not know whether Wilde really meant what he said, or whether he merely wrote it and then thought better of it. According to the account given by Robert Ross, Wilde gave him the manuscript on the day he left prison. In another place, Ross implies it was sent to him by Wilde while he was still in prison, with instructions to what to do with it. The two stories are contradictory. His lies, like Falstaff's, were gross and palpable. Knowing Ross's testimony on this is utterly valueless, it is impossible for me to arrive at any certain conclusion about De Profundis. I would endeavor to find out from Robbie's friends, if I was on speaking terms with them, supposing that they know it. Oscar Wilde's surviving son, Vivian, whom I have not seen since he was a little boy of 7 or 8 years, possibly knows the real truth, if he has not been deceived by Ross, which is quite on the cards. At the time when I wrote my book, Oscar Wilde and Myself, in 1914, just after the ransom case, I accepted Ross's story that Wilde was privy to the plot of keeping his attack on me secret and publishing it after my death. Now, however, I very much doubt the truth of this. I think it's quite possible that Wilde wrote De Profundis and thus purged his bosom of the rancor and unreasonable fury against my entirely innocent self. He gave the letter to Ross when he came out of prison, telling him to send it to me, or possibly telling him to keep it back for the time being. This seems difficult to believe, because he took the trouble to write the letter of over 60,000 words. That then, when he made friends with me again, as he did within 3 weeks of his release from prison, he put the thing out of his mind and thought no more about it. As it contained what he no doubt regarded as a lot of fine writing, the author's vanity would have prevented him from destroying it, and he may have had a vague intention of rewriting it. It thus remained in Ross's hands, and when Oscar died, Ross had it, and was free to do what he liked with it, and to tell any story he pleased. It is surely significant that nowhere and at no time Ross ever stated publicly and definitely that Wilde told him to keep the manuscript and conceal it from me. I do not know of the existence of the De Profundis manuscript till years after Wilde's death. I may have missed references to it which perhaps he made under the impression that I knew of its existence. He may have believed Ross actually sent it to me. He may have thought I received it, or that my silence was deliberate. He did have some ideas suggested by the fact, which I have recorded in Oscar Wilde and Myself, that on one occasion when we were together he referred to something he had said or written about me in prison. Ross, while Wilde was in prison, had sent me a letter containing extracts, which he alleged Wilde had made about me, but whether these remarks had been written or merely repeated I did not gather, because, as soon as I realized the nature of Ross's letter, which was very long, I tore it to pieces in a rage, and hurled the fragments into the river Marne, by whose banks I was living at the time. It's quite possible this letter of Ross's contained pieces of De Profundis. I am very much inclined to think Oscar never intended the letter to be used against me. Ross has deliberately misrepresented Oscar's attitude and intentions about De Profundis. If this is the case, it relieves Oscar Wilde of what is otherwise the blackest and most terrible charge that was ever brought against him. It was the belief that Wilde had really been guilty of this dastardly treachery and ingratitude. If Oscar has been wronged, all I can say is that he owes it to the evil genius, Robert Ross. By the time I started to write this book, I had pretty well convinced myself Wilde was not guilty, and it is this feeling that has enabled me to cut out of my heart the sentiments of anger, resentment, and indignation which inspired me at the time to write Oscar Wilde Myself in 1914. I entirely misrepresented the strength of my own love and devotion for him, which persisted right up to the time when I read the unpublished De Profundis in 1913. In doing this, I did less than justice to myself, because the only explanation of much of my conduct in regard to Wilde is precisely what I really was. I was crazy about the man. The truth is, I really adored him. I think it is fairly certain, in spite of all his protestations about his wonderful love for me, I really loved him far more than he loved me. His love for me, even allowing for the undoubted fact that pain and suffering did for a time transfigure it and touch it to finer issues, was yet chiefly founded on his mere admiration for what he chose to consider my personal beauty. I am sorry to have to say it, but I cannot but feel the explanation of the shocking way he behaved to me and about me during the last 2 or 3 years of his life after he came out of prison was simply because I was no longer quite so attractive. There is a passage in Dorian Gray which gives quite plainly his own views on this point. Lord Henry says to Basil Hallward, "One day you will look at your friend and observe his nose is a little out of drawing. You will resent it bitterly and feel he has behaved very badly to you." Whatever devotion I had for Oscar was certainly not founded on any physical admiration. I loved him because he was brilliant and wonderful and fantastic and fascinating in his mind and in his conversation. His personal appearance, at any rate when I knew him, was always rather against him. I thought him comic-looking. Afterwards, I got used to this strange aspect, and my admiration for his brain and the dazzling brilliance and spell-weaving enchantment of his conversation completely outweighed in my eyes the disadvantages of his appearance. When he got into his frightful trouble, my love for him was deeply intensified by pity and compassion. There was nothing I would not have done for him. It is a mere commonplace of truth to say I would have gladly died for him, or gone to prison in his stead. I am not now exaggerating the strength of the feeling I had for Oscar. I quote overleaf a sonnet that I wrote about him after he had been dead nearly 3 years. Alas, that time should war against distress, and numb the sweet ache of remembered loss, and give for sorrow's gold the indifferent dross of calm regret or stark forgetfulness. I should have worn eternal mourning dress, and nailed my soul to some perennial cross, and made my thoughts like restless waves that toss on the wild sea's intemperate wilderness. On the day Oscar Wilde got out of prison, he left the country. Before he left, he went to the Brompton Oratory and asked to see one of the fathers. He had then, as he thought, quite made up his mind to become a Catholic, and his idea was to get received. In this hope he would almost certainly have disappointed, for although he did really know rather more than the average Protestant does about Catholicism, many of his views were not only entirely unorthodox, but grossly repugnant to Catholicism. That Oscar did really die a Catholic, being received into the church by a Passionist on his deathbed, and while he was unable to speak, still able to make signs, I now believe. Though for a long time I doubted the genuineness and validity of this reception. My reasons for doubting them were Robbie Ross, with whom at the time of Oscar's death I was supposed to be, and imagined myself to be on the best of terms, told me most distinctively and positively that Oscar was quite unconscious at the time of his reception into the church, and he, Ross, had only got the Passionist father to consent to receive him by swearing Oscar asked him, before he became unconscious, to go at once and fetch a priest, as he was determined to die a Catholic. Ross told me Oscar said no such thing, and that the only justification he had for the step he took was that Oscar, years before, told him he intended to die Catholic, and that if he were in danger of death, Ross was to send for a priest. Ross, according to his habit, told various stories about the event, varying them. At the time when he told me, I was not a Catholic, and though not hostile, not particularly sympathetic to Catholicism. What Ross actually said to me was, "I hope you don't mind. You know how I feel about these things. Oscar several times in his life did express a desire to be Catholic, and said it was the only church to die in. So when he was dying, I took it on myself to fetch a priest and tell him Oscar expressed an earnest desire to be received. I thought it would make things easier in a Catholic country, and it would facilitate arrangements for his funeral and burial." I replied I was very glad he acted as he did. When in 1914 I collaborated with Crossland in the book Oscar Wilde and myself, I was in my own mind quite convinced Oscar had not died a Catholic. A man becoming a Catholic must ipso facto, if his conversion be genuine, forgive all those who have injured him and ask pardon for all he has injured. He also must renounce all heretical opinions and express contrition for all his sins, both of flesh and of spirit. St. Thomas Aquinas, who, Catholically speaking, is the ultimate word and touchstone of wisdom, lays it down that sins of the spirit are much worse than sins of the flesh, and that is the chief reason why I think the English attitude towards certain vices is indefensible, because hypocrisy is a spiritual sin. I must explain I do not mean a man who has committed sins of the flesh at one time of his life has not a perfect right to feel and express horrors at such sins, but a man has no right whatsoever to persecute or hound down another for doing what he has done himself. Let him that is without sin among you cast the first stone. A man cannot get out of this comfortably, as the average Englishman thinks he can by saying whatever he may have done in ways he has never, at any rate since he left school, gone in for Oscar Wilde's particular vice. I very much doubt if such a complacent view of the relative importance of his own and someone else's form of sin will cut much ice on the day of judgment. All sins of the flesh are mortal sins, and are all equally deadly, and on the other hand equally easy to obtain absolution for, with the proper conditions. Oscar Wilde left England forever, as it turned out, and went to the little village of Berneval, where a chalet was obtained for him. When he left prison, a sum of 800 pounds was subscribed for him by various friends, the largest contributor being Miss Schuster. I was not asked to subscribe to this fund. The attitude of Ross, who was chiefly responsible for getting up the subscription, was hostile to me, and his omission to ask me to subscribe was intended as deliberate. If I had been asked to subscribe, I might have been. I was living in Paris on a small allowance from my mother. I seldom had a penny to spare. The official attitude of Oscar, instigated and kept alive by Ross, was that he wished to have nothing whatever to do with me. If I had taken Wilde at his word and neither written to him nor attempted to see him again, the whole course of my life would have changed to my advantage. Instead of doing this, however, I wrote to him at once, and said, "I am told you now hate me, and do not wish to see me, or have anything to do with me. But all the same, I write to tell you I have not changed to you, in spite of all the efforts that have been made to put me to stick to you through thick and thin, and I long to see you again." It is almost certain this letter of mine, and a lot more that I wrote to Oscar about this time, were among the numbers which Ross appropriated and kept when Oscar was lying dead at the Hôtel d'Alsace. If so, it is almost equally certain that Ross's heirs or executors have got them. Once more, I ask that my letters should be given back to me. Oscar replied at once, in a somewhat priggish, if not canting, tone. He said he did not hate me, and on the contrary still loved me very much, but at present he thought it better we should not meet. Although it was not a very nice letter, it certainly was a long way removed from the sort of thing I had been led to expect. Under the rather formal and lecturing surface of the letter, it was easy for me to see Oscar was very far from having arrived at the state of mind so considered by the faithful friends, who were so anxious to take charge of his actions and feelings. I guessed at once he was longing to see me, but other people were putting obstacles in his way. A number of letters which Oscar wrote to me at this time have been published by a Mr. William Andrews Clark in America. They have been magnificently produced and are supplemented by notes which are ably and fairly written. At present, all I need to say is that the letters have been published. After Oscar and I had exchanged about half a dozen letters, he wrote and definitely invited him to come stay with him at Berneval. In a characteristically playful way, he has suggested that it would be advisable I assume some other name. He said in his letter he had been thinking of a suitable name for me, and was divided between Le Chevalier de la Fleur-de-Lis and Jonquil de Vallon. In another letter he informed me he decided I was to be Jonquil de Vallon, and referred to himself as that strange purple shadow, Sebastian Melmoth, which was, in fact, the name he adopted after he came out of prison, and by which I addressed him on the envelopes of my letters. All this, though it may now sound rather childish, was just like the old Oscar whom I had known and loved. I was just getting ready to start when a telegram arrived stopping me. The letter arrived and contained a story. He had been warned it would be dangerous for me to come, as my father was having him watched and would intervene and create a fresh scandal. This was a pure canard, but no doubt he believed it. He lamented the impossibility of our meeting in moving terms, but declared his devotion to me was only enhanced by our continued separation. I wrote back, laughing, that my father's supposed plot existed, and suggesting we meet somewhere else. He replied he would not come to Paris, as he could not face Paris yet, but suggest Rouen. So we agreed to meet at Rouen, and did so for one night and day at the Hôtel de la Poste, where I had stayed before and was known. This made the assumption of my assumed name impracticable, which I really think was a cause of great disappointment to Oscar. The meeting was a great success. I have often thought since that if he or I had died after that, our friendship would have ended in a beautiful and romantic way. Poor Oscar cried when I met him at the station. We walked about all day arm in arm or hand in hand, and were perfectly happy. Next day he went back to Berneval, and I returned to Paris, but we settled that when I went to Naples, he was to join me there. About a few weeks later, I went to Aix-les-Bains with my mother and sister. I stayed there 5 weeks and had a most delightful time. I wrote the Ballad of St. Vitus, which I consider to be the best of my 3 ballads. My mother went back to London, and I went to Naples, meeting Oscar on the train from Paris. We went to the Hôtel Royal, and I celebrated the occasion by running up a bill for £68 in the fortnight we were there. The bill remained unpaid right up to the time when I left Oscar for Naples. And my dear mother sent me £200 to give to Oscar, and also the money to pay the hotel bill and enable me to get back to Paris. The manager, being of course under the usual impression that an English lord is invariably a millionaire, seemed quite undisturbed by my request that he should let the bill stand over. While we were at Naples, Oscar finished the Ballad of Reading Gaol, and I wrote the 4 sonnets called The City of the Soul, my sonnet on the sonnet, and A Triad of the Moon. I had spent some months in Rome with my mother a year before, and we met my friend Harry de Wint. Harry de Wint knew Oscar well and admired his work and his conversation. We dined together in a cafe, and I afterwards happened to go away and leave them there together. Oscar and I were fairly happy in Naples, though we had several quarrels. He had nothing beyond an allowance of £3 a week from his wife, and I had very little money, only about £8 a week. The constant worry about ways and means was trying, and Oscar did not adapt himself as easily as I have always been able to do, at making the best of a small income. We were still great friends, and when my mother's ultimatum came as a bombshell to break up our association, we were both very distressed. Obviously, however, there was nothing for it but for me to leave. We were neither of us in a position to raise a penny, and it was merely a question of getting enough money to carry Oscar on till he could get more. I left him in my villa with 3 months' rent paid in advance. With ordinary care, the £200 I got for him would have kept him in Naples, where everything was amazingly cheap, in comfort for at least 5 or 6 months. I had lived myself on less money for as long a period in France without complaining. But Oscar remained only a few weeks in Naples. He then went to Paris. While Wilde was with me in Naples, he was in good health and good spirits. He was chiefly engaged in finishing his Ballad of Reading Gaol, of which he had concluded the rough draft at Berneval. He worked at it very hard, thus bearing out the contention I have always made that all good poetry is the result of struggle and effort, and that good poets do not pour out words like gramophones. I have been reminded of his struggles to get the ballad just right by reading the collection of his letters to Robert Ross written from my villa at Posillipo, recently brought out by Mr. Moore Ade. He says in the first letter in the collection, "Bosie has written 3 lovely sonnets which I have called The Triad of the Moon. They are quite wonderful. He has sent them to Henley. I have also got him to send his sonnet on Mozart to the musician." I had forgotten this till I read this letter, that it was Oscar who gave me the name Triad of the Moon for my 3 sonnets. My influence over him in the poetical line prevailed over that of Ross in at least 2 instances. I do not for a moment claim I helped Wilde to write his great poem. I can recall only one passage which owed something to a sonnet of mine which I had written while Oscar was in prison, and which I showed him. It had 2 lines: "Into the dreadful town through iron doors, by empty stairs and barren corridors." Those who know the Ballad of Reading Gaol will recognize that there is an echo of these 2 lines in the ballad, "That Night the Empty Corridors." Wilde apologized for borrowing, and I assured him he was quite welcome, and I meant it. That is the only passage which owed anything at all to me. All I did was to maintain, and that as I would now, that Wilde was a much better judge of what is and what is not proper to a poem than Ross, who could have not written a dozen lines of poetry to save his life. I am afraid my reminiscences of life at the Posillipo villa are very vague. We had a cook called Carmine, a maid, Maria, and 2 boys called Peppino and Michel, who waited on us. Servants cost little more than their keep in those days at Naples, and the cost of feeding Wilde and myself and the servants was about 12 francs a day. I remember the villa, which was charmingly situated with a terrace and marble steps leading down to the sea, was full of rats, so much so that I, who have always been terrified of rats, was reduced to the ludicrous pass of having to hire a room in a house opposite the villa to sleep in. After a time, however, we got rid of the rats, partly by means of a professional and orthodox rat catcher, but also for a potent witch who was recommended as infallible and who came in burned odors and muttered incantations. She also told both our fortunes. Oscar professed to regard her as a wonderful and powerful sorceress. In appearance she was quite the witch of literature and drama. She had a distinct beard, and with age and envy was grown into a hoop. Anyhow, the rats disappeared, and I was able to return to the villa. It was after I left Wilde in possession of my villa and with £200 of my money in his pocket that he penned his celebrated letter to Ross, to which I have already referred, in which he says, as soon as there was no money left, Bosie left me, and describes the incident as the most bitter experience of a bitter life. Considering I was forced to leave him much against my will, and that he for his part was also threatened with the loss of his pittance of £3 a week from his wife if he continued to live with me, and that consequently we both agreed it was necessary to separate, this letter is one of the most astonishing products that the history of literature has ever recorded. I translated Salome at Oscar's request while I was still at Oxford, and I wrote an article eulogizing the French play in my undergraduate paper, The Spirit Lamp. When I had finished the translation, to which I devoted a great deal of time and careful work, Oscar did not like it. In fact, he actually yielded to the solicitations of Aubrey Birdsley, whom I did not like, who declared that he could do a splendid translation, and that he thoroughly understood the spirit of the play, and who begged Oscar to let him do it. I was not unnaturally somewhat offended at this, and was rather gratified when a month later, after Oscar received and read Beardsley's translation, he declared it was utterly hopeless, and he would rather have mine, the manuscript of which I had meanwhile taken back. I told Oscar if my translation was any use of him he could use it, and anything in it he did not like he could alter. But I added if he altered it, it would no longer be mine, and so it would not be advisable to use my name. Oscar used my translation, making a few alterations. Really, I believe he originally wrote the play in English and translated it into French with the assistance of Pierre-Louis and André Gide, so that to get anyone at all to translate it was rather ridiculous. At the time Oscar wrote this play, he did not know French well enough to write a play in the language, and André Gide told me later Oscar's first draft was a mess of blunders and misspelling. Pierre-Louis and he knocked it into shape, and when it came time to a translation into English, Oscar just put it back more or less as it was. Consequently, I do not regard the present translation, which is usually attributed to me and which is dedicated to me, as mine at all. I think my own translation, as a matter of fact, was much better. During the next 2 years, I saw Oscar constantly in Paris when I was living in a small flat in the Avenue Kléber. I was still very hard up, but out of what little I had, I did what I could for him. As a matter of fact, during that time he really had far more money than I had. Though he had no regular income except his £3 a week, he was helped by a great number of people, including his biographer, Frank Harris. I must do Harris the justice of saying he is and always has been generous with money. I prefer not to say much more about these last years of his life. I have already related what happened when my father died, and I came into a modest amount of money, less than £15,000, of which I received only £8,000 at first. Oscar lived only a year after my father's death, and during that year I gave him at least £1,000, while he, for his part, as I found out years later, went about telling everyone he met I refused to give him a penny. I believe he did not do this out of malice against me, for the extraordinary thing is that in spite of what he was doing behind my back, he remained outwardly on the most affectionate terms with me, and we spent many a delightful evening together after I entertained him to dinner at Palliard's or the Café de la Paix or Mare's or the Grand Café. I think his sole reason for acting as he did was his desire to get money out of other people. He found his pitching the tale that, although I was now rich, I deserted him, and left him without money, was very effective in loosening the purse strings of others. Their pity for him, coupled with their indignation at me, made them generous. I judge this was his motive, partly because I can think of no other, and partly because he applied the same principle of me. Whenever I met him, he was always full of the meanness and want of imagination of Frank Harris, Robbie Ross, and anyone else who helped him in any way. Unlike Harris and unlike Ross, I discounted these statements from Oscar. If I had any inkling of the seriousness of his state of health, I would have rushed over to Paris at once, when I was in the Highlands of Scotland, where I had taken a small winter shooting. His death was a terrible blow to me. I arrived too late to see him alive, a fact for which Robbie Ross is solely to blame. For he wrote to me at Oscar's request and told me he was ill, but that it was nothing serious, and 2 days later telegraphed me that he was dead. I would have, if I had seen him before he died, and while he was still conscious, the whole course of future events would surely have been altered. For one thing, Ross would not have been able to appropriate my letters as he did, and for another thing, it is possible that Oscar would have told me something about De Profundis. At any rate, Ross would not have dared to touch any of the letters in manuscript without my consent. As it was, he told me when I arrived he had been through Oscar's papers and found nothing of the slightest importance, but was careful to ask me what I wished done about them. It was not disputed at that time by anyone that I was the person to decide such questions, any more than it was questioned that I should be the chief mourner at the funeral and pay all the expenses. I told Ross to do what he thought best about the papers, and I never bothered my head any more about them. The base use to which he put my letters, of which he thus obtained possession, has been related. When I reached Paris, poor Oscar had been dead 2 days, and was already in his nailed-up coffin. Robbie Ross and Reggie Turner, who were both with him when he died, gave me an account of the last days of his illness. Ross said not a word to bear out the horrible story of his end, which is related in Harris's disgusting book. Reggie Turner has categorically denied the story of the explosion and declares Oscar died quite quietly and peacefully. I have no doubt Ross's story, with its revolting details, is a pure lie. And what could have induced him to invent such a story about the man he professes to have loved so much must remain a mystery. Oscar was buried according to the rites of the Catholic Church in the cemetery at Bagneux after a requiem mass in the beautiful old church of Saint-Germain-le-Pré. I took the part of chief mourner of the funeral, and was in consequence taken by some of those who were present as his son. There were several persons at the funeral who were unknown to Ross and Turner and myself, including ladies and 2 others. One of them I afterwards discovered was a friend of my grandmother, the Honorable Mrs. Alfred Montgomery, who, being Catholic and knowing my connection with Wilde, came to pray for him. I have no personal knowledge about the facts of the removal of Oscar's body from the cemetery to Père Lachaise, which took place many years later under the direction of Robbie Ross. As long as I had my paper at the Academy, my enemies gave me a wide berth. During the whole time I had the Academy, I never had an action for libel brought against me. The libels always took the same form, insinuations or insults on the subject of Oscar Wilde. When this happened, I issued down writs at once, and in every case the libelers climbed down and paid up. The sums I got for compensation were for a long time quite a source of income to me. Among the sums paid as compensation, and in consideration of the discontinuation of legal proceedings, were 50 guineas from the Isis, 50 guineas from the Cambridge Magazine. In both cases, the undergraduate editors were dismissed, and their dismissal was taken into consideration as mitigation. With regard to the occasion in 1923 when I was convicted and sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment for libeling Mr. Winston Churchill, I have not the slightest intention of saying anything which might be regarded as a repetition of the libel. But what I can and will say is that my trial was a farce. I do not for a moment say if my trial had been differently conducted I would have established the truth, but I do say if I had been allowed to explain to the jury how I came to print it in 3 years before my trial in my paper Plain English, I would have convinced them that I acted in perfect good faith, without any malice, in what I considered to be the public interest to avoid more war. As I pleaded justification that would not have won me the case, but it would at least have made it practically impossible for the judge to send me to prison. The vindication of Mr. Churchill from the charges I had brought against him, which would have been at least as complete if nearly all my counsel's questions had not been overruled, or again if Sir Douglas Hogg had given me a chance to explain myself in cross-examination. It was very unfortunate for me that Sir Douglas Hogg, the Attorney General, happened to be the very counsel who had cross-examined me 2 years before for 6 hours on behalf of the Evening News, when I won my action against that journal. Sir Douglas knew what a formidable witness I was when I discussed the presence of the Jews in the Jutland affair. He had seen me win a case for myself out of the witness box against tremendous odds, and he had seen I had done it simply by getting the jury. Consequently, the next time he was opposed to me, he took the very unusual course of not cross-examining me. For the result was that I got no chance at all of using my brains and my gifts of speech and personality in my own defense. It really does not matter a pin now. My imprisonment nearly killed me, as I shall explain, but from a social point of view it has proved to be the turning point of my life. I have made more friends and converted more enemies by going to prison, as did, and in the cause which I represented, the cause of fearless criticism of public men, however well known, however powerful, than I had ever hoped to make again in this world. From that point of view, Mr. Churchill, who doubtless goes in for being a magnanimous man when he is not actually engaged in getting his critics sent to jail, will be pleased to hear that indirectly he has done me one of the best turns it was possible for one man to do another. It is not true that I am a man who is always libeling people. What is true is I am a man who is always being libeled. I have dealt with the only 2 cases in which I was accused of libeling a man, that of Colonel Custance, my father-in-law, and that of Mr. Winston Churchill. Even my worst enemy must admit I had nothing to gain by libeling Winston Churchill. All I did was to write about him what I believed to be true, at great risk to myself, because I thought it was my duty to my country to do so. For doing that I was sent to prison, where I was nearly starved to death, and from which I emerged broken in health. It has taken me 3 years to get over the effects of my imprisonment, and even so I can say that I have never been, and am very unlikely ever again to be, as well and strong as I was before it took place. What changed me from high Anglicanism to Catholicism was simply reading history, and finding out all the lies that had been taught to me as truth at school and at Oxford convinced me the high Anglican position, however attractive it may be, does not hold water. The theory the Church of England is a branch of the Catholic Church, and that the continuity was never broken at the Reformation, is demonstrably false. I held it, and abandoned it reluctantly, only because the evidence was too strong. What finally converted me to Catholicism was Pope Pius X's encyclical against modernism. This stately and magnificent piece of argument was sent round to the papers for notice. A copy of it was sent to the Academy. The original is written in Latin, but I got a copy of the English translation. I read it because I was interested. It had the effect of convincing me that the Catholic Church, in communion with the See of Peter in Rome, is the only true church. I made up my mind to become a Catholic, but I put it off chiefly because my conversion had come entirely through the intellect. I felt no emotion about it. The emotional side of Catholicism did not reach me till some time after I had been in the church. When I first joined it I was cold. The ritual, although I always liked it and thought it beautiful, did not influence me in the slightest degree. When I had been a Catholic for about 18 months, I underwent the most violent persecution, which lasted on and off for 10 years. The result of this persecution was to force me deeper and deeper into my religion. For years it was my only support and consolation in a succession of almost unbearable miseries. Instead of being cold, I became very devout and mystical. I lived on reading the lives of the saints, and such mystics as Saint Teresa and Saint John of the Cross. The persecution began with the attack on me in Ransom's book, inspired by Robert Ross. I have already dealt with this case. Mr. Ransom's book, Oscar Wilde, A Critical Study, appeared. I did not want to have any open quarrel with Ross, but I wanted to drop him. I did not wish to keep up my acquaintance with him. I told him it was because I no longer cared to associate with persons like yourself who are engaged in the active performance and propaganda of every kind of wickedness, from socialism to sodomy. When I read Ransom's book, I immediately determined to take proceedings. My wife was strongly against this. Those who still think that I made a mistake in taking proceedings against Mr. Ransom, and that all would have been well if I had simply ignored the libel in his book, which most people would not have noticed, as it did not mention me by name, ignore the whole nature of the attack on me. Everything that happened in my life after the ransom case followed logically and inevitably from that case. The ransom case was simply the first battle in a campaign, which, in the long run, I ended by driving all my enemies out of the field. It was losing the ransom case that made me take the fearful risk of publicly and persistently libeling Robbie Ross till I forced him into the open to prosecute me. If I had not sued Ransom for libel, I might as well have ended myself, as far as any prospects in this world are concerned. I look back with no satisfaction as to what happened directly after my loss of the 2 cases referred to. I practically lived with another woman for about 3 or 4 months. I saw her daily first for about a month, and went about her in a perfectly innocent way. I explained to her that, being a Catholic, I could not consent to lead an immoral life. In the end, however, I deeply regret to have to admit that I succumbed. I got hold of a certain amount of money by selling the books and letters of Wilde, and in advance royalties on the book, Oscar Wilde and myself. This enabled me to go on living at my partially furnished house in Church Row, Hampstead, to carry on the fight in Chancery about my son, and also to take this woman about all over the place, to London, to restaurants. I did this partly out of bravado, and as a demonstration against my enemies and against my wife, whom at that time I never expected to see or speak to again. I burnt all her photographs and everything else in the house that might remind me of her. Less than 4 months after our separation, my wife Olive rang me up one day on the telephone. I answered, not knowing who it was. She begged me to come see her. The sound of her voice on the telephone completely finished me, and I went straight off to see her, and we made it up. This, of course, caused a breach with the other woman, and my irregular life came to an end forever. This was in 1913. Although my wife and I have never lived together again, we are the best of friends. I often go to stay with her, and we keep up a constant correspondence. I do not want to go into detail over the struggle of my son. It would be impossible for me to tell the whole story without appearing to blame my wife, and I declined to do so. I will say I was never deprived of the custody of my son. The judge made a point of this, and seemed to think I ought to be very grateful. But as he ordered I was to pay all the costs of the boy's schooling, and during his holidays he was to spend 2/5 of the time with me and 3/5 of the time with his grandfather, and as moreover I had done nothing at all to make me unfit to have the complete custody of my own son, I could not but think then, as I think now, that I was treated with the most monstrous cruelty and injustice. My son, when he was of age and his own master, wrote and asked my forgiveness, which I of course gave him. Since then we have been on terms of the deepest affection. This action of my son was a bitter blow to my father-in-law, Colonel Custance, and he did not long survive it. No other paper, with the exception of the Morning Post, did so much as plain English to open the eyes of the public to what the Jews were doing. It is yet the incredible fact that some 2 or 3 years after the death of plain English, the Morning Post deliberately pushed a libel on me, written by a Jew, to the effect I had made it a paying proposition to publish vile slanders about the Jews. I sued the Morning Post for libel, and it pleaded justification. The case was fought entirely on the question of my allegations about Winston Churchill and the report issued by the Admiralty on the Battle of Jutland. Apart from this question, my attacks on the Jews were scarcely touched on in the trial. The Morning Post called Winston Churchill as a witness, and my counsel, in the middle of the case, suddenly announced that he would not cross-examine him. The evidence in cross-examination of Lord Balfour, which had taken on commission and was in court in official printed page form, was also suppressed. In the result, I got a very unexpected verdict, but only a farthing's damages. After my counsel's virtual throwing up of the case, I had no expectation of getting a verdict. The conduct of the Morning Post on this occasion, it has since changed hands, so that what I am saying does not apply to the paper as it is now, seemed to me so revealing of the sort of thing that commends itself to patriotic Britons, that in the end it almost revolutionized my feelings. I feel now it is ridiculous to make accusations against the Jews, attributing to them qualities and methods which are really much more typically English. No Jew that ever drew the breath of life would have rounded on another Jew in the way the Morning Post rounded on me. More than half of the vile slanders which I published in plain English on the Jews were taken bodily out of the columns of the Morning Post, written by themselves. And moreover, my policy on the Irish question and every other political question was identical with that of the Morning Post. It would be easy for me to show if I borrowed some of the Morning Post's facts and figures. They made no scruple to borrow in a wholesale manner and reproduce in their leading articles the same ideas and arguments. The more the ideas and argument of plain English were decimated, the more I was pleased. But that the Morning Post should help itself, as it did, to all my thunder, and then join hands with my enemies and squash me, seemed to me a clear case of out-Heroding Herod. My present view about the Jews is that if the English, as they apparently do, like to be bossed by the Jews and get very angry with anyone who tells them about it, there is no sense in blaming the Jews for taking advantage of the situation. If a nation or party or any body of persons chooses to lie down on its face and invite the Jews to come and trample on it, why blame the Jews? I used to get very excited about these questions and about politics generally when I had plain English. I was desperately sincere and quite ready to die or to go to prison for my convictions. But the way I was treated on this occasion by the Morning Post and by others who professed to share all my views, and the subsequent prosecution and imprisonment I underwent in return for my efforts to help my country, completely cured me of my desire to meddle further in English politics or patriotic movements. Leaving out all questions of my accusations against Mr. Churchill, for which I was convicted, and on which I do not desire to add a word, his reception into the Conservative party, after he spent 25 years of his life abusing, attacking, and trying to keep that party out of power, convinced me there was no place for me in English politics. I have no polite name for that sort of business.